He stopped at a quiet gas station to fix a flat tire, just another errand on the way to honor a fallen soldier's mother. But within minutes, he was face down on the pavement, handcuffed and humiliated. All because he fit a description. They didn't know he was a decorated 4-star general. How does a man trained to fight wars defend himself against prejudice at home? If this story grabs your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. Now let me tell you what really happened that day. It was the kind of afternoon that passed like a sigh, warm, still, and slow in the town of Weyridge. Not much ever happened there. Folks liked it that way. But something about that day felt off, like the quiet had started holding its breath. Malcolm Shaw pulled into the gas station just off Highway 12. His car was nothing flashy, just a dark gray sedan, the kind that blends into traffic. It had a slight lean on the back left side, and he eased it to a stop beside the air pump. There was nothing rushed in the way he moved. He got out, paused to straighten the collar of his shirt, then opened the trunk, pulling out a pressure gauge. Everything he did felt deliberate, like a man used to structure, used to being prepared. He crouched beside the tire, checked it, then stood up again, brushing off his slacks with the back of his hand. To anyone watching closely, he looked like someone's uncle, maybe a retired teacher, maybe a man who kept tools in his garage in labeled drawers. His hair was short-silvered at the edges, and his skin bore the kind of calm only earned through hard lessons. But in Weyridge, that wasn't what some folks saw. Carolyn Mills stood behind the glass counter inside the station store. She was wiping down a jar of lollipops, glancing out the window every few seconds. Her eyes settled on Malcolm for a little too long. Something about the way he didn't go inside. Something about how he didn't wave or smile. Her hand reached for the phone almost by reflex. "He's been out there a while," she said softly into the receiver. "Just standing by the car. Looks suspicious. I think you should check it out." She never mentioned the flat tire. She never mentioned he hadn't approached anyone or said a word. All she said was that she felt uncomfortable. That was enough. In a town like Weyridge, it always had been. Across the street, a boy named Darius sat in the passenger seat of his cousin's old pickup truck. The windows were halfway down, the summer air thick with heat and dust. Darius was 16, and like most boys his age, he noticed everything adults thought he didn't. He saw the way the woman behind the glass picked up the phone, her eyes never leaving the man by the air pump. He saw the way Malcolm stood upright, still focused. He knew that stance. His uncle back home in Greenville carried himself the same way after coming back from deployment. Darius reached for his phone and hit record. He didn't know why, just a feeling. But sometimes a feeling is enough. Malcolm finished inflating the tire and turned to open the driver's side door. He paused, resting one hand on the roof of the car, letting out a quiet breath. There was a weight in that breath, like he was shaking off something invisible before stepping back inside the world. Then came the sound of sirens. 2 squad cars pulled up, fast tires crunching over gravel, lights flashing, even though there was no rush. Officers stepped out like they'd been briefed for something dangerous. Malcolm didn't flinch. He turned toward them, palms slightly open by his sides. He didn't speak. Not yet. He waited. From across the street, Darius whispered to himself, "They're not even asking questions." Inside the station, Carolyn peeked from behind the soda machine. She didn't come out. What happened next didn't last long. It never does, but it left something behind. Something that wouldn't be easy to forget. That's where it started. Not with a crime, not with a confrontation. Just a man fixing a tire in the wrong place at the wrong time in a skin that made people nervous. A man who had walked through wars, who had stood before presidents, who had made decisions that saved lives. But none of that mattered on that patch of gravel in Weyridge. And Darius, camera still rolling, whispered again, this time quieter, "They don't know who he is." The sirens had barely stopped wailing when the first car skidded to a halt in front of the gas station. Dust curled into the air behind it like smoke from something already burning. Officer Brett Kessler stepped out with a hand already resting near his belt. His eyes, sharp mouth set. Right behind him was Officer Ray Delaney, slower, broader, but no less charged. They hadn't spoken to dispatch more than a few seconds, just enough to hear the words, "black male loitering," "suspicious," "alone." No details, no threats reported, Just a color, a presence, and a feeling. But for men like Kessler, that was all it took to trigger the story he already carried in his mind. Malcolm Shaw, still standing beside the car, turned toward them calmly. He didn't raise his hands, but he didn't hide them either. They were relaxed, visible. A lifetime of protocol embedded in every gesture. He nodded once, polite. His voice was steady when he spoke. "Officers, can I help you with?" That was as far as he got. Kessler didn't ask questions. He didn't slow his approach. He moved like someone who thought the danger had already been confirmed. With one sharp motion, he yanked open the car door and reached for Malcolm's arm. Malcolm stepped back instinctively, but it was too late. Kessler grabbed his wrist and spun him around hard. Malcolm's shoes caught the edge of the concrete curb and slipped. He hit the ground sideways, his shoulder striking first, the weight of his body dragging the rest of him down fast and ungraceful. Delaney closed the distance quickly and slammed Malcolm's other arm behind his back, pressing his cheek against the car's rear quarter panel with the kind of force that made metal groan. The tire Malcolm had just repaired hissed softly beneath them, like it too was trying to protest. "I'm General Malcolm Shaw," Malcolm said, his voice still composed but more strained now. "My identification is in my jacket," Kessler scoffed. It wasn't a laugh, just a sharp, contemptuous sound that said more than words. He leaned closer to Malcolm's ear, not whispering, but not speaking for the crowd either. "Nice story," he muttered. "But you don't look like a general." Malcolm didn't respond. His breathing was even, but his body stayed still motionless under the weight of their assumptions. It wasn't his first time feeling this, but it never got easier. Delaney reached into Malcolm's jacket roughly and pulled out a leather ID holder. He glanced at it, flipped it open, and paused. Kessler didn't look. He didn't want to. His hand was already tightening the cuff on Malcolm's left wrist, making sure the metal pinched just enough to leave a mark later. Delaney turned his head slightly, catching Kessler's eye. He started to say something but hesitated. Across the street inside the old pickup truck, Darius kept recording. His phone shook slightly in his hand, but he didn't stop. He hadn't blinked in 30 seconds. He could barely hear what was being said, but he could see enough. The way the man didn't fight, the way he moved with control, not fear, and the way the officers handled him like he'd already been found guilty of something unspoken. Inside the station store, Carolyn Mills watched through the blinds. She didn't come out. She never said another word. Malcolm was lifted from the ground, his shoulder already stiff, his clothes dusty from the fall. Delaney guided him to the back of the cruiser with a strange, practiced detachment, like this was the 100th man he'd cuffed that day, and the first he didn't feel entirely sure about. Kessler followed without looking back at the ID. As the door slammed shut behind him, Malcolm caught Darius's eyes from across the road. Just for a moment. He didn't nod. He didn't say anything. But something in his gaze held still, like an anchor being dropped. The squad cars pulled away without a siren. There was no crowd to disperse, no bystanders yelling. Just a quiet kind of violence. One that lived in the open, yet remained invisible to those who chose not to see. Darius lowered the phone slowly. For the first time in his young life, he realized what silence really meant. Not absence, not peace, but the pause before something breaks. And in that silence, one question hung over Wayridge like a low cloud. What happens when a man is punished, not for what he's done, but for who he appears to be? The door closed behind Malcolm with a cold, metallic thud, not loud, but sharp enough to silence everything else around it. The patrol car pulled into the back lot of the Wayridge police station without sirens, without urgency. It felt more like a routine delivery than an arrest. Still handcuffed, Malcolm stepped out of the vehicle without resistance. His wrists were tight behind his back, the metal biting into skin that had known war and peace in equal measure. But he moved with a quiet authority, like someone who had walked down far more dangerous corridors and survived worse than suspicion. The hallway smelled of old paper coffee and something faintly chemical. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing like a warning only a few would ever hear. The station wasn't chaotic. It was quiet. That particular kind of quiet that creeps in when people want to pretend nothing unusual is happening. As Malcolm passed through the intake area, most heads stayed down. But one young black officer behind the desk happened to glance up and froze. His name tag read Reynolds. His eyes landed on Malcolm's face, then dropped to the cuffs on his wrists. He paused, eyes narrowing. There was a flicker of recognition, not just in the name on the intake sheet, but in the posture, the upright spine, the measured steps, the calm dignity that didn't match the usual parade of arrests. "Malcolm Shaw," he murmured under his breath, almost involuntarily. He didn't say it loud enough for anyone else to hear. His pen hovered in midair, uncertain. For a brief moment, his hand trembled, not with fear, but with conflict. He knew the name. He had read it in a military bulletin once, maybe even seen it on a plaque at his grandfather's VFW hall. He remembered his father once saying, "That man led troops like he was born to carry their burden." But Officer Reynolds didn't speak. Not really. He glanced around, then simply looked away. Whatever truth he recognized, it wouldn't be voiced here, not today. That silence didn't go unnoticed. From behind him, Kessler stepped up, his voice soaked in mock casualness. Well, look what we've got, Mr. Shane, is it?" Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply turned his head calmly. His eyes didn't carry fire, just clarity. "It's Shaw," Reynolds corrected softly, barely above a whisper. Kessler didn't acknowledge him. He leaned against the desk and glanced down at the file as if it were beneath his attention. "General, huh?" "Never heard of you," he sneered. The words weren't meant as disbelief. They were meant to erase. Malcolm took a breath. Not deep, not dramatic, just steady. "You don't have to know me," he said gently, "to treat me right." That sentence lingered in the air. It didn't shout. It didn't demand. It simply settled there, undeniable and heavy. Delaney, who had been following behind in silence, lifted his eyes toward the ceiling. A small red light blinked from the camera mounted in the corner. He coughed once subtly and gave Kessler a slight nod. Kessler stiffened. He hated reminders that someone might be watching him, especially someone who didn't blink. But he didn't escalate. Not with a record light blinking in the room. He stepped back with a smirk that barely masked his restraint. "Take him to holding," he muttered. Malcolm walked on his own, flanked, but not forced. The holding room door clicked open with a buzz. No one guided him. He stepped inside like he belonged. Not because he did, but because dignity can't be revoked with a pair of cuffs. The door shut behind him. Malcolm didn't sit. He didn't pace. He stood in the center of the room, arms still cuffed behind his back, posture unbroken. A steel bench lined the wall, and a camera blinked above the corner, always watching, never intervening. He stood there not because he was stubborn, but because he knew exactly what this moment was. The quiet wasn't just emptiness, it was pressure. It was judgment. It was a test. Outside the holding room, Officer Reynolds stood by the desk, staring blankly at the intake forms. His fingers tapped the edge of the clipboard rhythmically. Inside him, something cracked. He had told himself not to get involved, not to speak up, not hear where silence was often mistaken for safety. But now that silence felt like betrayal, he knew who Malcolm Shaw was, but more than that, he knew what Malcolm Shaw stood for. And for a split second, he wondered if he would ever stand for anything at all. Back inside the room, Malcolm looked up at the ceiling camera. He didn't glare. He didn't smile. He simply met its unblinking eye with the quiet defiance of someone who had survived both war zones and courtrooms and knew which one left deeper wounds. In this room, no one spoke for him. No one shielded him. But still he stood. Even caged dignity speaks louder than rank. And somewhere beyond the steel and silence, the question burned quietly into the walls. Who else was watching? Darius didn't say anything when he got home. He didn't tell his aunt about the man at the gas station, or the way those officers yanked him from his car like he was furniture they didn't like. He didn't describe the way the man had looked at him, calm, collected, not asking for help, but not hiding from it either. He just sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, staring at the footage he'd recorded. There was no shouting in the clip. No screams, no punches thrown, just a man standing beside his car, just a voice saying, "I am General Malcolm Shaw, check my ID," and another voice saying, "Nice story, but you don't look like a general." That was it. It was the stillness that stuck in Darius's throat, the way no one seemed surprised, the way silence had become its own kind of violence. He posted the video with just 6 words. He never raised his voice, ever. No hashtags, no taglines. Just the truth. The video didn't explode immediately. It trickled. A few reposts here and there, one teacher in Chicago, a journalist's niece in Houston, a blogger in Ohio. But then it landed in the inbox of someone who didn't need a caption to understand what he was seeing. At Fort Brenton, a military base hundreds of miles away, First Lieutenant Brian Oakley sat in the mess hall scrolling through his phone between bites of cold pasta. He wasn't looking for anything, just killing time. But the moment he saw Malcolm's face, his hand stopped midair. He leaned forward, rewound the clip, and watched again. He remembered that face, not from YouTube, not from headlines, but from a desert night in Syria. Oakley had been pinned behind a flipped transport, bleeding out through his flak vest, barely conscious. And then he had come Malcolm Shaw, calm under fire, no shouting, just a hand on his shoulder and a voice that said, "You're not dying today, soldier. Eyes on me." Oakley watched the clip 3 more times. Then he stood up, walked out of the mess hall, and sent it to his commanding officer with only 3 words. "That's him. Shaw." The next morning, at an office 2 floors above the armory, a colonel clicked the same video open and said nothing. He didn't call a meeting. He didn't write a report. He forwarded it to 2 generals with the note, "Track it." That was all, but it was enough. In less than 24 hours, the footage had reached the inboxes of command centers in 5 different states. No outrage, no official statement. Just a steady undercurrent, a recognition of something deeply wrong. A quiet ripple of men and women in uniform, passing it along, many of whom had stood with Shaw or followed behind him. Many of whom had never met him, but had trained under his directives, fought beside soldiers he'd shaped, or read his commendations in quiet admiration. They didn't blast their reactions across social media. They didn't organize protests. They didn't need to. They remembered. Back in Virginia, a retired Navy medic named Cole Jennings sat at his kitchen table sipping black coffee when the clip appeared in a veterans forum. He hadn't seen Malcolm Shaw in over a decade. The last time Shaw had stood in a hospital wing at Walter Reed, hands in his pockets, refusing to leave until Cole's daughter, then 10, had gotten the toy rabbit she lost during transport. Cole clicked open a new post. Title, "The Man They Forgot to Salute." He wrote not about the arrest, not about the injustice, but about the character of the man in the video. About the time Shaw had covered a younger soldier with his own body during mortar fire. About the stories passed around campfires, not in briefings. And one sentence that stood out. If General Shaw stood still, it wasn't because he was scared. It was because he knew exactly who he was. That post made its way into veteran groups across the country. Old-timers on Facebook shared it quietly. Some typed short comments. "That's him. He saved my squad. Didn't think I'd ever see his name in a headline, and not for a medal." It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Because sometimes the loudest thunder starts with a whisper. And in rooms filled with medals, silence is often the clearest form of respect. While the world outside Wayridge went about its day, something had begun to shift. Not with hashtags, not with outrage, but with memory. A slow-moving tide of people who knew who he was, who remembered what he'd done, and who would not let that name disappear into the dust of a holding cell. It had begun. Not a protest, not a movement, just a spark. And sparks in the right places have a way of becoming wildfires. The room had no clock, no window, just a flickering fluorescent bulb that gave off the kind of white light that didn't warm anything, only exposed it. There was a bench bolted to the wall, a camera in the upper corner that blinked as if it had better places to be, and walls painted that off-gray color that made every person look smaller than they were. Malcolm sat, hands resting quietly on his knees, the cold of the steel seeping through his clothes like a slow accusation. His jacket had been taken, his phone, his wallet, even his ID. He had given them his name more than once, clear, calm, enunciated like a man who had said it in press briefings and battlefield orders alike. But the tag on the door read John Doe. No one called him that to his face. Not yet. But he saw the paperwork being passed through the window, heard the muttering at the desk outside, the slow, deliberate typing of someone choosing to pretend they'd never heard of Malcolm Shaw. He wasn't surprised. Through the thick pane of glass, he could hear the familiar voice of Officer Kessler, loud enough to carry, quiet enough to claim he wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. "This guy really thinks he's a general. That's a new one." Laughter. Not a lot, but enough. A snort from someone in uniform. Then Delaney added dryly, "Maybe next week we get a guy who says he's the Pope." Malcolm didn't move. He didn't look toward the glass. He simply sat straighter as though the cold metal beneath him were a podium and the silence a crowd. The buzzing fluorescent light above him gave off a soft hum, and in that stillness he spoke not loud, not sharp. Just enough for it to reach where it needed to go. How many other men, he asked, have you slammed into pavement without checking who they are first? The room outside fell quiet. There was no response, no apology. Just the sound of shifting boots, a throat clearing, and the quiet discomfort of a question that didn't require an answer to be understood. He wasn't trying to shame them. He wasn't trying to provoke. He was naming a wound that had been festering long before his hands were ever cuffed. And he said it not with anger, but with that unsettling calm that comes from knowing the truth will either land or haunt. Outside that room, the world was beginning to take notice. The video, short, shaky, and silent, had crossed over from veterans' circles into broader channels. A local newscaster had mentioned it in a segment tucked between weather and sports. A civil rights group had clipped the video and shared it with the caption, "Dignity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands still." And still inside that station, Malcolm was nobody. Not officially, not on paper, not in their eyes. A young clerk brought him water in a paper cup. She didn't look him in the eye. She set it down on the bench without a word and turned to leave, but paused just before the door. "I saw the video," she whispered, not turning around. Malcolm looked at her. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I'm aware," he replied softly, and then she was gone. Back behind the one-way mirror, Delaney shifted uncomfortably. He didn't like this kind of quiet. It wasn't submission, it was something else. Something older, something that felt less like weakness and more like weather, slow, heavy, unstoppable. Kessler stared at this monitor feed, jaw set, arms crossed. "He's just playing a part," he muttered, as if trying to convince someone, maybe himself. "He's probably a teacher or a preacher or just real good at lying." Delaney didn't respond. He just kept his eyes on the screen. Something in the way Malcolm didn't blink, didn't beg, didn't try to explain something about it, made the cuffs on his own belt feel a little heavier. Malcolm reached for the cup of water. His hands were still cuffed, so he bent his body awkwardly to sip. It wasn't graceful, but he made it seem like a ritual. A small act of dignity in a place built to erase it. He didn't know how many hours had passed, but somewhere beyond those cinder block walls and the steady hum of the ceiling light, his name had already been spoken in offices he once commanded. Messages were moving, not frantically, not yet, but steadily. As steady as his breath in that cold room. Inside, he was still just a John Doe, but outside, the world had started remembering. And it was only a matter of time before someone opened the door, not out of procedure, but because silence had cracked too wide to ignore. They brought him in through the side door, still in cuffs. No announcement, no courtesy. Just a shuffle of steps that echoed through the quiet courtroom like an afterthought no one wanted to claim. Malcolm didn't need to scan the room to know where he stood. He'd walked into war zones with less tension than this, but it wasn't fear that hung in the air. It was the still familiar chill of being unacknowledged. The courtroom was modest, tired around the edges. A few rows of gallery benches, a scratched-up defense table, and a judge's bench raised high enough to remind everyone who had the final word. The bailiff didn't announce his name. He just nodded at the judge and pulled out the chair for him to sit. Still cuffed, still unnamed. Judge Ronald Grayson flipped through a folder like it was an old receipt he wasn't interested in keeping. His voice was thin-clipped procedural. Case number 17B3. Suspect is a black male, mid-50s. No valid ID provided. Charge obstruction. Obstruction. Malcolm said the first words he'd spoken since the cold room. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "I asked them to check my credentials." Grayson didn't look up. "You'll speak when asked to, sir." Malcolm sat back, not defeated, just assessing. Across the aisle, Rachel Knox rose, young, sharp, and polished like a scalpel. She didn't look at Malcolm, only at the paper in her hand. "Your Honor." The accused male failed to comply with lawful instructions during a routine inquiry at a public facility. He was nonverbal, refused to present identification. "That's not true," Malcolm said flatly. Ellison, his court-appointed attorney, turned quickly. "General, sir, please let me." But Malcolm wasn't done. "I gave my name. Multiple times. I told them to check my ID. It was taken." Judge Grayson's voice snapped like a dry branch. You will not interrupt the court again. One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt. Ellison stood, hands shaking just slightly. Your Honor, if I may, my client has identified himself as General Malcolm Shaw of the United States Army. His ID was confiscated at the time of arrest. We respectfully denied, Grayson interrupted. Until such time that identity is confirmed through official channels, he remains the accused. Rachel Knox cleared her throat. Shall I continue? Grayson nodded. In addition to non-compliance, the accused male was uncooperative during detainment and Malcolm leaned forward, his eyes locked on her. You know what's uncooperative, ma'am? Being slammed onto concrete while trying to greet someone with civility. The gallery stirred. Rachel hesitated. Your Honor. But before she could continue, a voice rose from the back. Wait a minute, an older man whispered, just loud enough to carry. Is that Shaw? Heads turned, slowly, cautiously. Another man leaned forward, whispering, He saved my unit in Basra. That's him. That's the general. Judge Grayson looked up for the first time, eyes narrowing. Order in the gallery. Any more interruptions and I'll clear the room. But it was too late. The silence had already cracked. A woman near the aisle stood, her voice trembling. That man doesn't belong in cuffs. He's a hero. Grayson slammed his gavel. Remove that woman now. 2 bailiffs moved, but the woman didn't resist. She turned to Malcolm instead. We haven't forgotten who you are, she said softly. They may act like they don't know, but we do. Malcolm met her gaze, then nodded once. Rachel Knox's voice was thinner now. We request this be handled by the book. No distractions from the gallery. Grayson rubbed his temple. This court doesn't care for rumors or theatrics. We deal in facts. And Malcolm, with quiet steel in his voice, replied, Then check them. The room fell still. Even Knox didn't continue. Even Grayson paused. For the first time, it was no longer a courtroom watching a defendant. It was a room realizing they might have put justice itself on trial. It happened during a recess. Judge Grayson had called for a 15-minute break after murmurs from the gallery refused to die down. The courtroom emptied in parts, people stepping outside for air, for cigarettes, or maybe just to let the tension roll off their skin. Malcolm didn't move, still seated, still cuffed. He sat in silence, head slightly lowered, as if measuring the weight of the air around him. His lawyer whispered something, but he didn't answer. The public defender's voice didn't matter anymore, not in a room where facts were refused and names meant less than uniforms. Then, without warning or announcement, they began to enter. One by one, not loud, not marching, just walking. Uniforms, pressed clean, decorated. 3 of them at first, then 5, then 8. Some young, some older, some carrying medals that caught the light when they moved. They didn't speak, didn't flash credentials. They simply found seats in the gallery, lowered themselves slowly, and folded their hands on their laps. Every eye turned. They weren't there to protest. They weren't there to argue. They were there to be seen. Colonel Marcus Ellison entered last. He moved like someone used to silence someone who'd watched the worst of humanity and still believed in the structure meant to contain it. He paused near the aisle, eyes locking with Malcolm's across the courtroom. He gave one small nod. Malcolm didn't return it, but his spine lifted just a breath more upright than before. Kessler noticed them too. From his place near the witness bench, he shifted. He leaned to whisper something to Delaney, but his voice was tighter than before, less sure. He glanced at the uniforms, then back to Malcolm, only this time the look was different. No longer condescension. Now it looked like recognition and worry. Rachel Knox remained standing behind the prosecution table reviewing her notes. Her expression hadn't changed much until her phone buzzed. Just a single vibration. Subtle. But she reached for it like someone expecting news she didn't want to see. It was an email from a private account. Subject: You should see this before the next motion. Attached a video. She opened it. At first, nothing but hallway footage. Then a timestamp. A location: Police Academy 2021. Officer Kessler in plain clothes shouting off camera. A young black recruit, barely 20, pressed against the wall. Kessler slamming his fist against a locker near the recruit's head. You think you get to talk back, boy? The recruit doesn't flinch, but the fear is obvious. There's no audio after that, just body language. But it's enough. Rachel froze. For the first time since the trial began, she looked at Malcolm with different eyes. Not pity, not anger, but calculation. Like something inside her had clicked into place. On the bench, Judge Grayson had returned clipboard in hand, tapping his pen rhythmically. His eyes skimmed over the military presence now lining the gallery. He cleared his throat once. Then again, I assume these are not members of the press. No one answered. Colonel Ellison didn't move, but someone in uniform whispered, "We came to watch." It was not a threat, not a demand, but it echoed louder than the gavel had all day. Grayson shifted in his chair. "Let it be noted that courtroom conduct is expected from all attendees," he muttered, voice cracking slightly. Military or not, Malcolm remained quiet, but his gaze never wavered. The weight of the room had changed. It wasn't just that uniforms had arrived. It was that silence had taken sides. Rachel Knox turned toward Kessler. She didn't speak, but her stare said everything. Kessler caught it. His jaw tightened. And in that moment, the courtroom wasn't foggy anymore. It was sharp, clear. Lines were being drawn not in raised voices or protests, but in posture, in presence, in the way people no longer averted their eyes. The judge had lost the room, and deep down he knew it. He straightened the papers on his desk and said louder this time, "Let's resume." But the sound of that single sentence landed soft, like it was already too late. Malcolm lifted his head, eyes fixed forward. And for the first time that day, people saw him not as the accused, not as a black man in cuffs, not as a name on a file, but as who he was, and who he had always been. The silence in the room was starting to feel permanent, like furniture. It sat on people's shoulders. It hovered just beneath their breath. Judge Grayson glanced up from his notes and shifted in his chair, clearly unnerved by the quiet that no longer seemed to belong to him. Malcolm hadn't spoken a word since the hearing resumed. His eyes had moved slowly across the room, measuring faces, noting changes not in uniforms, but in posture, in gaze. He knew what came next. The shift always came right before the break. Then he rose. He stood tall, wrists still cuffed in front of him, shoulders squared not from pride, but from memory of who he was, of where he came from, of what he had seen men do when silence was mistaken for surrender. I was silent. Malcolm began, his voice smooth, quiet, but full. Not because I had nothing to say. I've worn silence like armor. I've used it to survive places where words would get you killed. I carried silence like a flag. A murmur moved across the courtroom. Judge Grayson looked up sharply. "You're out of order," he snapped, tapping the gavel once. "This is not your platform, and this is not about race." Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He tilted his head slightly, eyes locked onto the judge. "Then why," he asked slowly, "do you keep saying it isn't?" The room shifted again. Not physically, but in tone. Something had cracked, not loud, but deep. Kessler shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Rachel Knox looked up from her notes, but said nothing. Her silence wasn't neutral anymore. It was calculating. She had seen too much now to pretend she hadn't. Then a voice rose from the gallery. It was a woman's voice, strong and clear, carrying through the chamber like a bell at dusk. "He saved my life in Fallujah." Heads turned. A woman in uniform stood. Mid-30s, bronze star ribbon on her chest. She didn't speak for attention. She spoke like someone who had carried the weight of that sentence for years. "I was bleeding out," she said. "In the back of a transport vehicle. We'd been ambushed. Everyone else thought I was gone. He didn't. He stayed with me. He carried me." She paused, eyes locked on Malcolm. "You don't forget the man who wouldn't let you die scared." No one told her to sit down. No one could. Malcolm looked at her, and for the briefest moment his face softened. Not in relief, not in gratitude, but in recognition. She had broken first, so he didn't have to. Grayson's face tightened. "This is highly irregular." "No," Malcolm said, voice rising now. "What's irregular is being tackled for fixing a tire. What's irregular is being dragged through a system that doesn't bother to ask who I am before deciding what I am." He stepped forward. The chains clinked softly, but the sound didn't diminish him. "I have commanded operations in foreign deserts, negotiated ceasefires under sniper fire, and carried men out of burning buildings with bones broken and blood on my face. I have faced enemies who knew they were enemies, but never did I think I'd come home and be treated like a threat for standing still." Rachel Knox stood now. Not to object, just to stand. She was staring at Grayson. Her mouth opened, but she said nothing. It was as if she too had run out of excuses. The gallery had fallen completely silent again, but it wasn't passive. It was charged. because for the first time they weren't watching a trial. They were witnessing a reckoning. Grayson adjusted his glasses. His hands trembled as he reached for his gavel. But before he could strike it again, another voice came low, male, gravel thick. "Sir, permission to speak." It was Colonel Ellison. Grayson looked up, stunned. "No, you may not. I was there," Ellison said, ignoring the judge entirely. "In Syria. In the compound. I saw what this man did. And I saw how he carried the wounded while injured himself." Ellison turned to the gallery. "Some of you have medals because of what he did. Some of you are still breathing because he stayed behind." And still Malcolm remained steady. No pride. No smile. Just stillness. As if all of this wasn't for him. As if it was for them. For every name they'd buried. For every time a black man in uniform came home and had to shrink just to survive. Grayson looked utterly lost now. The room was no longer his. He had the robe, but not the command. The tension in the courtroom was no longer crackling. It had settled into something quieter, heavier. Like the whole room was waiting for something they couldn't name. The judge hadn't spoken in several long moments, his gavel useless in his hand, his face drained of authority. Then the bailiff approached, quietly slipping a folded note into Judge Grayson's hand. He opened it with a twitch of irritation, expecting perhaps a procedural update, a complaint, anything mundane. But the handwriting was not familiar, and the words were brief, underlined twice, SecDef on the line. His eyes snapped up. He rose without a word and walked out through the side door, leaving the courtroom in frozen silence. In the private judge's chamber, the phone was already on hold, blinking. Grayson sat, slowly picked up the receiver and pressed it to his ear. There was no greeting, no introduction, just a voice, measured, cold, unmistakable. "This is Secretary of Defense Wallace." Grayson swallowed, leaning forward instinctively. "I'm aware of the situation unfolding in your courtroom," the voice continued. "Drop all charges, immediately. Issue a public apology, not tomorrow, not later. Now." Grayson straightened in his seat, the instinct to defend himself bubbling up fast. "Sir, with all due respect, this court follows due process. We have a system." "You're not protecting the law," the secretary cut in sharply. "You're protecting your pride. And you're doing it in front of the entire nation." Grayson's mouth opened, then shut again. "I've seen the footage," the voice pressed on. "I've read the service record. And I've read the transcripts from this morning. You dismissed General Malcolm Shaw like a man asking for leniency. He didn't need leniency. He needed recognition. He needed dignity. Silence. I don't care how long you've worn that robe, Judge. I don't care what club you think you're still a part of. You will walk back into that room and you will do what is right. Or I will make damn sure the whole country knows why you couldn't." There was a brief pause and then the line went dead. Grayson stayed there for a moment, phone still pressed against his ear, though the voice had already vanished. The silence left behind wasn't peace. It was the kind that echoes sharp and unkind. He slowly stood up and walked to the mirror mounted on the far wall. For a long second, he looked at himself. Not the robe, not the courtroom shell, but the man inside it. A man whose name had once meant something. Who had built a career on measured judgment, even-handedness, balance. But the face staring back at him now looked unfamiliar. It wasn't the face of justice. It was the face of someone who had failed to see, failed to listen, failed to lead. His shoulders dropped, not with shame, with clarity. He turned and walked back into the courtroom. The murmurs in the gallery faded the moment he reappeared. People could feel something had shifted. Grayson moved slower now, not from defeat, but gravity. He didn't look at Knox. He didn't look at Malcolm. He only looked at the room. He sat, let out a slow breath, and then said simply, "This court has received new information that necessitates an immediate reconsideration." His voice had changed. There was no force in it, no command. Just the weariness of a man who had realized how small a robe can be when justice gets too big. "The charges against General Malcolm Shaw are hereby dismissed." There was a beat, not celebration, not applause, just stillness. Then one quiet exhale from Rachel Knox, from the clerk, from the woman in uniform seated in the second row. Malcolm didn't move. His expression didn't change. But something loosened in the room, as if everyone had been holding their breath in his place. Grayson continued, "This court offers its formal apology to General Shaw for the treatment he received, for the assumptions made, and for the system that allowed them." He paused just long enough for the words to settle where they needed to. Then he added quietly, "I failed you, sir. And I hope history judges you better than I just did." And with that, he leaned back in his chair, not as a man in power, but as one who finally understood who had been sitting in front of him all along. The courtroom, once brimming with tension and breathless anticipation, now felt stripped down to its bare bones. The kind of quiet that doesn't rush in, it settles slow and wide like snowfall in a place that hasn't seen winter in years. Judge Grayson sat upright, but the lines on his face had deepened. The words he prepared weren't scripted. They didn't come from any legal textbook or procedural guide. They came from somewhere else, perhaps shame, perhaps truth, perhaps both. This court formally declares that all charges against General Malcolm Shaw have been dismissed. There was no cause for his detainment, no justification for the force used, and no excuse for the failure to recognize his identity, his dignity, or his record. He paused. "I offer not as a judge, but as a man a public apology to General Shaw for what he endured here today and for what it represents." His voice was dry, not by lack of care, but by the erosion of authority. He was no longer standing at the peak of control. He was looking up from the edge of a mistake, hoping it could be named and owned before it swallowed him whole. At the back of the courtroom, Colonel Ellison stood and stepped forward. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need it. As he reached the bench, he took the keys from the officer beside him and, without a word, knelt slightly to undo the cuffs from Malcolm's wrists. The click was soft, but it rang louder than any gavel had that day. Malcolm didn't flex his hands, didn't rub the red marks. He simply stood, straight, still, unshaken. The same way he had entered that courtroom hours earlier, with the calm of a man who'd survived too many storms to flinch at wind. He turned slowly, not toward the judge, but toward the people, the audience, the uniforms, the strangers, the boy in the back row with a phone still gripped tight in his fingers. And then he spoke. I didn't raise my voice. He let the words sit for a moment. The room leaned closer. But now he said, looking each face in the eye, "You all hear me." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Because what he'd carried through handcuffs and false accusations wasn't just silence. It was history. It was memory. It was the weight of every time a man had to beg to be seen while standing in plain sight. He stepped down from the platform without waiting to be dismissed. No fanfare, no guard escort. Just the quiet rustle of a room parting not because of protocol, but respect. As he passed the aisle, Darius, still seated near the back, heart thudding against his chest, leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered more to himself than anyone else. They tried to break him. He watched Malcolm walk, shoulders unbowed, chin steady, but he stood straighter. At the door, Malcolm paused only once. He looked back, not at his accusers, but at the gallery. The eyes that had once judged now followed, and some, you could tell, would carry this day with them longer than they expected. He left the room not as a free man, he had always been free, but as a reminder, a warning, a proof that dignity isn't something you hand over just because someone demands it. It's something you hold, especially when the world tries to pry it from you. Outside the courthouse, there were no reporters, no crowds, just sunlight pooling on the steps and wind brushing through the flags above. And inside the courtroom, silence lingered. But not the kind born from fear or control or the weight of power. This silence was different. It was the kind people hold when they've just witnessed something they can't unsee. When truth, stripped of anger, still lands with force. When silence isn't weakness, it's the last word. And this time it was heard. Some stories don't just end, they stay with you. This one wasn't just about a courtroom or a uniform. It was about dignity that doesn't need to shout justice, that takes its time but never forgets, and the quiet strength of a man who refused to be erased. General Malcolm Shaw didn't raise his voice, but he was heard. And in that silence, we all saw something that can't be unseen. How deeply we need truth, courage, and respect in our system and in ourselves. If this story touched you, please like this video. Share it with someone who needs to feel it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more true-to-life narratives that challenge, inspire, and stay with you long after the screen fades. Your support means the world to us. Every view, every share, every comment helps our creative team continue bringing powerful, meaningful stories to life. Here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't chase noise. We chase truth quietly, but boldly. And that's what makes the silence unforgettable.